Well, good morning. Happy Wednesday. So we had a question on Wednesday about lagoons and whether the lagoons are lined or not. So after class, I emailed the plant superintendent of the East Lansing plant and asked if the lagoon is lined or not. And the response that I got was that no, it is unlined. And it's unlined because the spent lime is designated as inert and is a natural constituent of the groundwater in the region. So this is actually a regulatory decision. So in order to determine where to dispose, how to dispose of the sludge, one goes through a review by the regulatory agency, so whatever agency is primacy, and they determine how that sludge can be disposed of, where it can be disposed of, what criteria, for instance, testing needs to be done on whatever basis in order for that final disposal to be as designated. So that's the situation with East Lansing. Meridian Township, it is unlined. So that does mean that there is the potential for the hardness ions to migrate back into the groundwater. Turned out I had gotten another email pertaining to another matter from MDEQ or Eagle on Monday. So I responded to that with asking some additional information. That happened to be about alum sludge and disposal of that sludge. It was not about the Muskegon plant, but so that gave me an opportunity to ask some additional questions about disposal. So generally with coagulant sludges, either alum or ferric, then typically inert does not apply. And again, what has to happen is there is a regulatory review, and if the sludge is determined or designated as having a beneficial use, then it can be land applied as stipulated by the permit. The response I also got from one of the engineers at Eagle was that basically this is the response, there are some examples of lined sludge holding lagoons, and he mentioned the Muskegon water treatment plant. So I went online, got an aerial photograph of the Muskegon water treatment plant, and what you can see here are these sludge lagoons. And these really operate much like the drying beds on the previous page. These are engineered. And what he had mentioned that this was a great example of a more recently engineered solution, and this is a lined bed. So, but he said most are unlined. So hopefully that answers the question. If not, let me know and I will try and get more information. That was the information that I was able to obtain in the last couple of days from staff at Eagle. So you can see these sludge drying beds, and the one at Muskegon looks a lot like this one here. I mentioned the other day when I showed this and the sound wasn't working.
Oh, that's so cool.
And you can see that sludge cake, that filter cake falling down, and it is quite loud in this room as when they're operating this. Okay, so what I would like to do today is to finish the unit on residual management. We've been talking about wastewater sludges. So the last part is to look at volume reduction. And we had talked about that as important. In this case, where we're looking at digestion, there typically is no subsequent process. The sludge from the digester is then trucked off to one of multiple locations, and we'll talk about that. So aerobic digestion is basically an extension of activated sludge. It's accomplished by aerating the sludge, just like one does in an aeration basin. The difference is that we're taking that waste activated sludge, and that goes into the aerobic digester. The supernatant from that goes back to the headworks of the plant. That supernatant is highly concentrated. It's got a high concentration of BOD, total caldol nitrogen, and total phosphorus. And your treated sludge typically has about 3% solids. The goal is to meet the regulations and 40 CFR. CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 503, are the standards for use or disposal of sludge. So these are the requirements that must be met in order to either dispose of sludge to perhaps a landfill or to use it as a land amendment or a soil amendment to apply it on land. So the basic premise of this regulations are to reduce pathogens, reduce vector attractions. We want to make sure that we're not transmitting disease through various different vectors, for instance, insects, rodents, etc. We want to reduce the volatile settled solids, and that requires what's typically referred to as degree days. So that is the detention time times the temperature in degrees C. The alternative in terms of digestion is an anaerobic digester. So an anaerobic digester operates in the absence of oxygen. The advantage of aerobic, and we'll talk about safety issues with anaerobic, but the major advantages are it's safer, it has a lower capital cost, it has a relative ease of operation. So those are the advantages. The disadvantages are compared to anaerobic digestion, it has a higher energy cost, and it's also very much temperature sensitive. And that's basically same premise. You're converting BOD to COD, to nitrogen to nitrate, phosphate forms to organic phosphate to inorganic. When we're looking at aerobic digestion, notice here, okay, we're adding oxygen. So what are we doing here? We're converting that biomass to CO2 and producing ammonium ions. So we take that nitrogen from the biomass and converted it to an ammonium ion. This tends to result in an increase in pH. We use oxygen, we produce CO2. Nitrification, we're looking at taking this the ammonia that we produce. Okay, looks like we're back. Sorry. Nope, it was my Wi-Fi here. I apologize. Okay, so the ammonia is converted to nitrate by nitrification. Typically, this is going to result in a decrease in pH. Notice we're producing H+. We need more oxygen to do that. 3 is just the sum of basically 1 and 2. So we're looking at digestion with nitrification. I'm going to skip 4 because it's basically the same thing. 4 is denitrification. And here what we're doing is we're taking this nitrate that we produced previously, and we want to convert this to nitrogen gas. Ideally, we don't want ammonia. We want a complete conversion to nitrogen gas. So you can see we need a significant amount of oxygen. We convert the carbon to CO2, and we're converting the nitrogen to nitrogen gas. So essentially that's what's happening in an anaerobic digester. So as I mentioned, it's very much temperature sensitive. Ideal temperatures are between 20 and 30 degrees. We want the temperature above 5.5. Less than that inhibits the microorganisms. It's affected by, we refer to the stability of the sludge. So basically how effective these reactions are, and the biological diversity, what organisms we have present. And as I mentioned, the regulatory requirements are pathogen reduction and vector reduction. So we want to make sure that we're not transmitting disease through various vectors such as insects and rodents. This is just a photo of an anaerobic digested dewatered sludge. You can see it here. It's this very black, it looks kind of like topsoil. And as mentioned, these photos are actually from the author, from Dr. Mackenzie Davis, and he noted that odors do not appear to be an issue, say open storage. You can see there's homes very close by. So you get a waste that really does not have a significant odor. So now that's aerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion is done in the absence of oxygen. So it's a series of reactions. The first being a hydrolysis reaction where we're taking the fats, the proteins, the polysaccharides that are left in this waste that didn't get oxidized in the in the aeration basins. So this is in the sludge. Those get converted to triglycerides, fatty acids, sugars, and amino acids. The next step is acid fermentation. Now, these compounds are then further oxidized to produce volatile fatty acids, many of which are extremely malodorous, alcohols, and new bacteria cells. In both step 1 and 2, we're not achieving much reduction of the BOD or the CO2. We're not stabilizing. When we talk about stabilizing, we're talking about forming compounds that don't consume oxygen in the environment. Acidogenesis or acetogenesis results in either the formation of acetic acid or hydrogen and CO2. So it's one or the other. You'll see in the next slide. And then finally, methane fermentation results in the formation of methane gas and CO2. So we think anaerobic digestion, we're looking at, in terms of stabilizing the carbon, we're stabilizing it to CO2. We're also producing methane, and that methane can be used as a fuel. This is basically the same pictorial image of what I just said, and you can see we produce these volatile fatty acids, and then we can either produce acetic acid or we produce hydrogen and CO2. Either way, we produce methane and CO2 as the final products. These systems are operated at higher temperatures, so you can see the temperature is higher than for aerobic systems. pH needs to be between 6.8 and 7.2. If it's less than 6.8, it results in what is referred to as souring. Souring of the digester means that the methane formation is inhibited. The contents of the digester become acidic, and that is a significant problem. So one wants to make sure that there's sufficient alkalinity so that when acids are being produced, that pH doesn't decrease below 6.8. We also need to make sure that it's free of toxic compounds. And this is extremely important. That methane that's produced, as I mentioned, can be used as fuel. Your digester has to be heated. So for instance, at the plant that my dad worked at for many years, they had anaerobic digesters. They heated all of the digesters with the methane that was produced. They ran the blowers for the aeration tanks with that methane. And they actually sold off excess methane to the power company, Public Service Gas and Electric. That worked wonderfully until the plant superintendent decided that they could make some significant money by allowing industrial waste to be discharged to the sewer. Well, this is quite a few years ago. There were few pretreatment requirements for this industrial waste. So it went from essentially almost entirely a municipal plant to a municipal plant with industrial discharge. That resulted in significant increases in various toxic chemicals. Their methane production decreased significantly and actually resulted in them having to supplement the energy needs in the plant with natural gas in order to, or probably diesel at that point in time, actually, in order to provide aeration and to heat the digesters. So it's extremely important that you make sure that the wastewater coming in is free of toxic compounds. Advantages: you're producing methane. It's a significant energy source. You're not adding oxygen, so you're saving on the need to aerate the system. And as with aerobic digesters, the supernatant goes to the headworks of the plant. You've got to keep, it's essentially a recycle loop. There's no place to discharge that supernatant other than either the environment, which would be of significant, call it a disaster, negative impact on the environment, or to recycle it back to the headworks. These are just some images of a single stage and a high rate digester. So you see a single stage digester. These require a large tank volume. They require a long detention times, typically 30 to 60 days if it's heated. They have low loading rates, and they have this thick scum layer. And actually, if you see that the active digestion layer is typically only about a third of the tank volume. The rest of the supernatant, the scum layer, digested sludge storage, and gas storage. A high rate digester, on the other hand, is completely mixed, requires, again, a heat exchanger, and the digested biosolids are discharged from the bottom and your digester gas from the top. And again, we have a recycle back to the headworks of the plant. A two-stage digester is basically a combination of a standard and a high-rate digester. So the first stage, fermentation occurs. It's mixed and it's heated. And the second stage, the solids are separated. And you can see, so you've got the solids separating, you've got your scum layers, you've got your scum removal, gas on the top, and an active digestion zone. These are just some photos, again, from the author, from Dr. Mackenzie Davis, and just showing you, typically these have a floating cover. The flexible, these are the flexible compressed gas lines, and they need to be flexible because your cover is floating depending on the amount of gas in the digester. Just some other photos. You can see here are the floating cover roller guides to allow it to move up and down. Lightning arrestors, these are extremely important. Remember, we have methane. We don't want to ensure that there isn't the potential for a spark, in this case from lightning. And we've got a radar roof sensor, again, to make sure that the roof is level. This is the gas burner and boiler used to heat the anaerobic digester. It's very typical. There are significant safety issues. So what you see here are we have a gas monitor to ensure that we don't have any leaks of methane. Methane is an explosive gas. We have an explosion-proof light switch. We have explosion-proof light fixtures. So significant efforts have to be taken within the digester buildings to make sure that there aren't issues like this where there are explosions at the wastewater treatment plant. It's one very recently in the UK, it's on last week, and 4 people died from an explosion. You can see the roof, how that has exploded. The one in 1976, I grew up on the East Coast. It's actually one that I remember, probably also because my dad worked at not at this plant, but my dad worked at a wastewater treatment plant, and a child was killed when an explosion occurred at this treatment facility. So safety, as I mentioned, safety is paramount. We need to make sure that we do everything we possibly can to ensure that these systems are safe. Finally, we can also use incineration or wet oxidation as for volume reduction. As I mentioned, the city of East Lansing did incinerate waste. It was up through, I think it was the mid-90s or so that they were incinerating waste, their sludge. They stopped actually because of the state implementation plans for air quality in the area. It would have been too costly to have continued incinerating and to add all of the additional control technologies that would have been necessary on the incinerator. So they no longer incinerate, but one can incinerate biosolids. It's highly energy intensive because one has to completely evaporate the water from the sludge. And if your sludge is only 5 or 10% solids, that's a significant amount of water that one has to evaporate. So it requires fuel. The solid material is inert, so that ends up in the ash. If it's bottom ash, it ends up at the bottom of the incinerator. Fly ash, it has to be removed before it's released from the stack. And that requires that the exhaust gas be treated. Wet oxidation can also be used This again requires energy. The solid material is also inert. So the disadvantage of these are you're not producing a waste that has any value. There's still a significant amount of, for instance, phosphorus in that waste that is a potential benefit. The waste is no longer beneficial if it's treated by incineration or wet oxidation. And then the ultimate disposal can be land spreading. This is regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, known as RCRA, often used for lime soda ash sludges, and in some cases, coagulation sludges. Again, it must be designated as beneficial use and it has to be permitted. It can also be used for applying on turf grass. Turf grass doesn't require significant nutrients, but the sludge can be used for water retention. It can be blended with topsoil, again, for water retention. It can be used as a road subgrade. It has to be quite inert. If it's degrading there, that's going to affect your subgrade. It can be co-disposed with sanitary sludges. So basically mixed, the water treatment sludges mixed with municipal sanitary sludges and then disposed of, and it can be landfilled. For wastewater sludges, they're designated as Class A or Class B, and that's based on the pathogen density. And they can be either landfilled. So for instance, the East Lansing plant has been landfilling their sludge. It's collected in a hopper, transported to the Granger facility to a biological landfill, and the landfill, because it's a biological landfill, recovers the methane. So it does produce energy, but in the landfill. Or it can be used for dedicated land disposal. Again, one needs to be careful there and make sure that there's limited public access. There's restrictions as far as cultivation of crops, how that land can be used. And I mentioned a little bit the other day with Lapeer and the disposal of the sludge from their plant and challenges with PFAS. So hopefully this gives you a sense of treatment. Any questions?